Okay. Thank you, Parm, Gill, and Gabrielle.
Thanks, Jenny. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beyond Aesthetics, Effective Visual Design for Online Courses. So my name is Gabrielle Coombs. I'm a learning designer based at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Parm. I'll let her introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Parm Gill. I'm an instructional designer at Fraser University, also in British Columbia.
So we're really excited today to delve into how to leverage visual design for online courses. Before we get started, we'd like to start by acknowledging that we're joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Coquitlam, Cookite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples, upon whose lands both UBC, Vancouver, and SFU reside. In the background, there's an image of a place in Squamish, which I took when I was on a hike. You can see the turquoise river, rocks in the foreground, and fir trees in the background. So on our agenda today, we're going to start with an explanation of the value of effective visual design, the idea of beyond making it pretty. So we're talking about things like increasing access, removing visual barriers to improve cognitive accessibility. And then we're also going to be looking at some visual design techniques, touching on things like universal design for learning and some strategies that will address things like web accessibility standards and ways to increase diversity inclusion in your visual design. We're also going to share a few examples and hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for questions. Our goals for today's session are to recognize the importance of visual design in online learning environments, to help select strategies to enhance readability and accessibility for all learners, to identify and mitigate visual communication barriers that may impede learning, and to help folks implement visual design techniques which connect research findings with practical applications to enhance learning experiences. So before we really dive into the meat of our presentation today, we'd love to hear from you. We want to know what your visual design pet peeves are, or things that really bother you about how online course content is presented visually. There's a QR code here that you can scan with your phone, and we're also going to put a link to this poll in the chat. So visual design pet peeves. We'll give everyone a little moment to respond. Lists of links. Oh, yeah. Too many emojis. Oh, yes. Yeah. They say this all the time. Too many colors. Yep. Oh, yeah. I'm glad everyone is experiencing the same things that we are. Oh, yeah. Type of resource. That, yeah. Lots of words on a slide. Too many different fonts. Yeah. One of my personal pet peeves is like alignment just being all over the place. Not chunked, overuse of templates, overly professional. Sure, totally. Good. Yeah, this is great. Okay. So we're going to jump into the first part of our session, the Beyond Making It Pretty part. And we've chosen this title for our session today because this is often the request that folks like myself and Parm as instructional designers receive. Here's my content, now make it pretty. We're going to argue today that through multidisciplinary evidence and research, that visual design can really go beyond just making things pretty to provide effective learning experiences which can impact access and accessibility and can bolster universal design for learning as a practice. So we're going to start off with the idea that visual design improves learning. Understanding how people learn and process information really helps inform visual design. And this is where the role of instructional designers is really pivotal. If we're thinking about cognitive science and cognitive load theory in particular, this posits that learning can require immense cognitive load. That's the effort required by the brain's working memory as one tries to learn. And sometimes this cognitive load comes from the intrinsic value or difficulty of the content itself, but it can also come from the complexity of how something is presented. This is known as extraneous cognitive load. So when we're using visual design, we have the ability to decrease the extraneous cognitive load that's based on how information is presented, so that learners' working memory can be used to focus on complex content rather than on trying to find information. So psychology also can inform our practice of visual design in our context. And we're taking evidence from things like eye tracking and reading studies here, which shows how users read information on the web and which factors motivate them to trust and continue using a web platform. So if we're going to be leveraging some of these features in online spaces that we know are going to motivate and generate trust with our students, we can really help them in getting the most out of their online course. Also, if we're applying graphic design principles to learning content, this can allow for much faster information processing, and well-designed graphics are going to grab our attention. I'm sure whenever you look at a web page, a eye-grabbing piece of visual design is really going to entice the user. And this is going to be much faster than just text on its own. There's evidence to suggest that visuals and multimedia are more likely to be stored in our long-term memory, which leads to better information retention. And finally, there are numerous research studies that support the foundational multimedia principle that people learn better with images and words rather than just words on their own. So, given that we have this evidence base, we're really hoping to use and leverage visual design to engage learners. And we'll start with this quote from Pamela Hogel: "Design is a gateway. It's the first thing people notice. So if they have to work to get past your design to get to the heart of the content, they are already tired and irritated by the time they get there. So good design will help navigate people through your content as opposed to creating additional roadblocks." I think this is a really effective quote. So we know that well-designed learning environments are important for good learning experiences. Educators often put a great deal of effort into designing buildings and classroom spaces, but unfortunately that same attention isn't always given to online learning spaces. While there's many evidence-based strategies to help make online environments more welcoming, accessible, and equitable, we're going to focus today on visual design specifically, and also focus on how it can make things more equitable and accessible. We'd like to note that while visual design on its own cannot compensate for poor instructional design or poor content quality, it can help to engage learners and potentially enhance their learning. We see visual design as a critical component of successful instructional design, aiding students' effective learning, providing ease of use and access, and meeting all students' needs through meeting technical accessibility standards and leveraging UDL. So let's talk about effective learning, the emotions that come into play when we're in the classroom. We know that research shows emotions play a key role in shaping memory, cognitive processes, and decision-making. So if you think about a very emotionally charged moment or event in your life, you're probably going to recall more of those details of that event than a time that didn't really have much emotion or emotional connection going on. So why is this really important for online learning? There was a landmark study at MIT which looked at how fonts and layout impact emotions. This study found that readers felt worse while reading poorly designed layouts, but felt better reading well-designed layouts, and also it took them less time to do so. So if we think about that, the way that content is designed, particularly if visual design has been used effectively, it can inspire a feeling of trust in the quality of the overall material. So evidence suggests that users of websites and e-learning platforms judge their quality and credibility based on visual design elements. There's also research that indicates that students evaluate online courses better when there are images included compared to a text-only course. Using visual design is really important for inspiring a sense of trust in your course. We'll also mention that simple and consistent visual design will improve the student experience by removing some of the negative emotions that are associated with online learning. Things like frustration or diminished motivation, often coming from not being able to find what you're looking for. And then finally, you can use colors and visuals really effectively to impact how students feel about their learning environment. So if you're using particular colors, say reds and orange, could indicate warmth, or blues and greens to indicate calm. This can really help instructors in creating the kind of environment or sense of community that they're looking to create in their online space. We do recommend keeping white backgrounds though. Most LMSs will have a white background. Recommend keeping that just for accessibility purposes. So moving from feelings to access, and when we say access, we're thinking about being able to find what you're looking for, wayfinding, and things like cognitive load. So an online course should really aim to strike a balance between great form and great function. Visual design, no matter how beautiful or affecting it is, really can't exist without also meeting the functional requirements of that learning space. So aesthetic design components, we really want to stress, should not impede students' ability to access their learning materials, find information, or submit content. That's poor visual design. So consider using clear layouts and visual cues that can aid wayfinding. And when we say visual cues, we're talking about small variations in the appearance of your graphic display, which are intended to assist a reader in using their screen more efficiently. So using visual cues is really going to reduce time for students to locate information. But we'll note that it's important that they use consistently. We'll use the word consistent quite a lot in our presentation today. And also keeping in mind that the cues that you're using, students are able to make meaning of what those cues are trying to say. We want to also mention avoiding cognitive overload as part of wayfinding. Ease of access is really important. It's the ability for people to easily intuit how a space works, knowing how to find information, and being able to do so efficiently. So we want to stress that your aim is to reduce or remove extraneous and redundant information because it can create confusion and cause students to lose focus and motivation in their learning. And also students really appreciate predictability in visual design. If they know how to engage with information because it's presented consistently, they're more likely to be able to focus on the content rather than on the platform. It's going to limit the amount of working memory that's required for them to navigate their environment and pay more attention to the complex course content. So moving from access to accessibility, and we're thinking about accessibility today from a web standards perspective. Often people think about accessibility as a restriction on visual design, but we're arguing today that adhering to these standards means that the visual design of your space is going to benefit the widest range of students possible and create a more equitable learning experience. We'd really love to shout out the guidelines from the WC3 Web Accessibility Initiative. They're a great starting point for accessible visual design, both from a cognitive standpoint and a technical standpoint. So when we're thinking about cognitive accessibility standards, while they're intended to benefit people with cognitive and learning disabilities, these practices can benefit all learners. From a visual design standpoint, if we consider making our designs easy to distinguish, easy to navigate, easy to read, easy to predict, we can leverage what we already know about good visual design for the benefit of students with disabilities and also really all students. We'd also like to reference the POUR principles too as a guiding space for visual design work. That's POUR, P-O-U-R, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So when you're thinking about designing your space, it's important to think, can anyone access this? Is it going to be perceivable? Are all elements perceivable? It might be important that you provide textual alternatives for some of your visual design components if it's necessary. Operable, does it work? Can your students operate the space? This is that wayfinding piece. Can you leverage visual cues in your visual design to aid how students find the information that they're looking for? Understandable, does it make sense? Is the information written clearly? Is it in plain language? Are visual aids being used effectively to aid students' comprehension of complex ideas? And is it robust? This is something that often gets forgotten. Does your visual design work in different contexts? You have to, what's something important to understand is a lot of students in online learning programs are not accessing their learning spaces on a laptop. They're probably doing work on their commutes on their phone in between lunch breaks, that kind of time. So think, does it work on a laptop? Does it work on a tablet? Does it work on a phone or other device? We're going to describe some visual design strategies to support these pieces later in the session. And to finish our sort of evidence-based part for like investing your time in visual design, we wanted to touch on UDL, Universal Design for Learning, the instructional framework that addresses individual learner differences and needs in order to remove barriers and provide equal opportunities for learning. UDL is organized around the 3 principles of providing multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. And so if we're thinking again, how can we bolster UDL using visual design? It's the intentional application of particular strategies. So if we're thinking from a cognitive accessibility standpoint, thinking about clear representation of content. So that's going to help students decode information quickly. So using things like your layout, headings, and visual cues to break up the content. If we're thinking about technical accessibility, we're thinking about paying attention to color contrast, alt text for images. We'll get into all of this in more detail in a moment. But the idea here is that we're trying to ensure that students are able to engage and perceive content in multiple ways. And finally, from an inclusion standpoint, can we choose visuals, select images that are going to reflect the diversity that exists in our classrooms, and select icons that are going to be understood by all students? So with that, we have a good foundation now for why it's worth investing lots of time in your visual design of your online courses, or at least sometimes being really intentional. I'm now going to pass over to Parm to review and explain some visual design techniques.
All right, thank you, Gabrielle. Next, we're going to move into exploring strategies and based on the relevant theories and research evidence. Take a moment to look at this image. And I think most of us will explore it in the way that the image predicts. So this image demonstrates how layout, text size, formatting, and graphics work together to guide the reader's eyes. I'm sure most of you viewed it in the way that's predicted. This is based on English language readers, so there may be a few that have read it differently. I'd be interested to know. What I particularly like about this image, it shows how our brains are programmed to look for faces. In particular, we tend to focus on eyes. So eye tracking research is helpful for understanding how layout, typography, visual design principles can be used intentionally to guide readers through the content in ways that aid learning. If you want to do a deeper dive into this, the Nelson Norman Group has done extensive eye tracking research on how people read online, and we'll share that in the resources at the end. But it is important to consider how reading and scanning are different. When we read, we're looking at the words, mostly in chronological order. And when we're scanning, our eyes look at some of the words and some headings and some images, and these are out of order. Both reading and scanning serve a purpose in an online course, and you want to make sure that students are quickly able to scan to find the information, but you also want to optimize the online reading parts. So to move on to the next slide, I'm going to start with the course overall layout. So one of the things to avoid is the wall of text. These are the big, long, tall pages, text heavy, which often can demotivate students. You can see from this eye scan image that attention varies. The red color indicates that the top of the page and the left sides are where readers tend to focus. Use this prime real estate to front load with the most important information on your content page. It's important to pay attention to the page width and the height. While we're reading long lines of text, our eyes tend to tire and drop off. The page width for optimal reading comprehension is about 75 characters width, or about 15 words. So another consideration to keep students engaged is to limit vertical scrolling. Research shows when students are scrolling on long content pages, they switch into scanning mode and they're less attentive. And this effect is even more pronounced with neurodivergent learners. So aim to keep the vertical scrolling to about 1 to about 2.5 screen heights at the most. And break up large blocks of text with paragraph breaks, headings, and white space. Including graphics, charts, or other media can help further chunk information and give your eyes something to hook on to. Be sure to design for multiple devices. Most learning management systems are responsive now, but it's still important to consider the student experience. Test out your course on multiple devices if you can. Don't use tables to lay out the page content. Instead, use CSS and HTML that allows for screen reader access and flexibility on different devices. Reserve the use of properly formatted tables to present data and information only. For longer tables, you might want to use alternate shaded rows, add cell padding, borders to make it a little bit more cognitively accessible. Another option is to provide a downloadable spreadsheet document for technical accessibility. White space is another great strategy to make content stand out. I work in the Canvas LMS a lot, and the default typography doesn't include enough white space after the paragraphs. So I'm in the habit of adding a soft return, like a shift enter, to add a little bit of more vertical white space. And I also do this at the bottom of the page. It just adds a little bit of breathing room. And when in doubt, opt for more white space rather than less. It's important to manage the overall visual complexity, and that is a combination of text, images, formatting, alignments, visual cues, media, etc. So considering limiting that can help reduce cognitive overload. One thing you can do is to limit to a few colors. Don't use decorative graphics, and limit graphic use to those that enhance learning. Don't include long bulleted list or numbered list, limited to 6 to 7 items. And take care not to use graphics as with a background image with text on top. That makes reading difficult, and be sure to group related elements together. So now I will talk about the fonts, because that has a big impact on readability. Choose clear and legible fonts. Font size should be large enough to read on multiple devices, and including enough space between the words and the line enhances readability, particularly for those with low vision or dyslexia. Use bold and italics sparingly for emphasis and not for large blocks of text. Avoid all caps as they're difficult to read and pose issues for some screen readers. Sometimes they tend to read out the letters as acronyms, not as words. Use bullet points and lists for easy scanning, and reserve numbered list for only when the sequences is important. Limit color use and consider contrast. Make sure there's adequate color contrast ratio between the text and the background. You can use accessibility checkers or color contrast checkers. Web browsers have plugins that can do this. Some LMSs have this built in. Don't rely on color alone to convey meaning. For example, red and green text is hard to distinguish for people with particular types of color blindness. If you bold that text, it can at least be distinguished as something different or something to be emphasized. Keep in mind that colored underlined text normally indicates a text link. Since the beginning of the internet, the blue underlined text was used to indicate links, and it remains the most easily identifiable as links. Links should always look different than the normal body text and format it consistently. And link to meaningful text to emphasize the content of the link instead of using repetitive terms like click here or click for more. And this will help with screen readers. Alignment impacts how quickly materials can be read. Multiple alignments on a page create more visual complexity and extraneous cognitive load. Small changes like left aligning all of the text can improve readability and flow. Additionally, left alignment is known to help neurodivergent students with conditions such as dyslexia. Justified text should be avoided, as uneven spaces between the words can reduce readability. And be sure to keep related items like photos and tables situated near the related texts to help learners make connections. Don't forget to include alt text to describe images meaningfully, add captions to photos, and particularly for complex graphics. Ensure video transcripts are formatted correctly for easy reading. So next, for visual cues, In face-to-face interactions, instructors can cue students to materials and activities, either by pointing, or using their voice, verbal instructions, or intonation. In a digital space, the visual cues can help provide that little bit of extra guidance. So visual cues include things like heading, formatting, icons, dividers, outlined or filled boxes, bulleted lists, and white space. So visual cues are helpful to structure the content. They can help readers identify important concepts and clarify intentions on why specific content is chunked or set apart from the main content flow. One technique I'm fond of using is a horizontal line at the bottom of a content page to separate a list of additional resources that are related to the content on the page. And students can easily tell that these are not required, they're just there for extra resources. I use visual cues as active or for passive emphasis. So by that I mean active emphasis is something that draws attention and to something students must actively do. So they can quickly scan a page and locate an action item, things that they must complete for the course, things like discussions or readings. And then I use another style for more passive emphasis, such as an outline box, again, with a heading for screen reader accessibility. And that way they can quickly identify the extra non-essential information. And icons are really helpful for identifying active and passive emphasis on particular areas. Icons also demonstrate the cognitive theory perspective that low complexity icons, those with less detail, they require less cognitive resources to understand and therefore less time to encode into long-term memory. So using the icons consistently to highlight the action items like quizzes and assignments helps learners find that information very quickly. My personal preference is I use both an icon and a heading in formatted boxes. Visual cues can aid learning, and the research shows that icons can help readers improve the recall of key information. And again, keep inclusion and accessibility in mind when using cues or things like icons and emojis. Be sure the graphics you select can be understood consistently across cultures and social groups. One example I'd like to share is the folded hand emoji. It could either be a prayer or a thank you, and by some people it can be viewed as begging. So next, we're going to talk about selecting graphics. And this is a really important part of your visual communications. Graphics should focus on the most complex concepts in your course, and they should be visually engaging. Be sure not to just repeat the text content, but rather use those graphics to show relationships, processes, data that is hard to explain in words alone. So things like diagrams, flowcharts, timelines, or visual metaphors. Select the images thoughtfully. Keep in mind that the context of the audience and their reactions that particular images may provoke. For example, if your course requires the use of images that could be distressing, be sure to let students know in advance. In some cases, illustrations might be a better choice over more graphic photographs, for example. Make sure the graphics are clear and understandable. And in particular, be careful with animated graphics. Be sure that they're not flashing or fast moving images. And the research evidence shows that user control improves learning. So if you do need to animate, if you have give students the ability to stop, pause, or re-watch the animation, that is ideal. Be sensitive to cultural differences. Select images that improve representation. Try to be inclusive of all learners, whether this is selecting images that reflect diversity in the classroom to selecting icons that can be understood consistently across social groups. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about graphics for learning. So the evidence supports that students who are exposed to graphics which are relevant to instructional goals do perform and learn better. So it's important to consider how graphics function and which types are best aligned to the instructional content and learning goals. So graphics should add to the learning experience. Decorative graphics tend to be the most commonly used in online courses. However, they are the least effective, and eye tracking studies show that readers tend to tune them out. Using too many graphics can actually be distracting. And decorative images could be shapes like the flourish on this slide, or they can be just images that people use for visual appeal only. Basically, every graphic should be aligned to learning objectives and should clarify, explain, or reinforce key concepts. So moving on the next slide, we're looking, the first quote is from Richard Meyer's Multimedia Principles for Learning, which were created in 2001. People learn better with words than pictures and than words alone. And this is founded on cognitive load theory. The research prior to this and afterwards supports how both words and graphics work together to encourage learners to make connections and how this helps with retention. And as we mentioned earlier, some types of images are better to learn from than others. And you'll see here, this is an illustration from a research article that shows that decorative images actually don't have a negative effect on learning. So on the next slide, we're going to talk and show you some images that actually do help for learning. So the first type is representational graphics. These are realistic images normally. They represent objects, people, or scenes. They're used alongside the text to reflect and reinforce information. They work well for showing facts and concrete ideas, and it makes them very popular in training materials. In storybooks, for example, they can be used to show characters or scenes, and in those cases, they may not be lifelike. So examples can be photos of people undertaking tasks, pictures of equipment, storybook illustrations, etc., screen captures. The next type is an organizational graphic. These graphics provide structural frameworks for the text content to help build mental models. They're helpful to show qualitative relationships, and they also can serve to organize information and help make text content more coherent. So examples can be process flowcharts, Venn diagrams, step-by-step illustrations, maps, or illustrated timelines. And the next one, relational graphics, they focus on quantitative relationships of the course content. They're a really powerful means for learners to understand large sets of data quickly, and they're most effective when they're placed near the related text. So line charts, pie charts, bar charts, infographic data visualizations are great examples of this. The next type is a transformational graphic. These show movement and change over time, step-by-step processes or procedures. Examples are before and after images, a series of smaller graphic illustrations, or animated images. And next, my very favorite one is mnemonic graphics. These are my favorite because they are the least type of graphic used for education, but these type of graphics actually have the most learning and performance benefits. They serve as visual cues that trigger the recall of facts and hard to remember information. By connecting the learning material with visuals, it makes it easier for us to hold on and remember the information. So examples are like this one, text and images combine meaningfully to associate facts, ideas, and concepts. Sometimes they can be concepts that are personified as quirky or personal expressive elements. And then the last image, the interpretive graphics, they help learners understand abstract ideas. They're useful to illustrate theories, principles that help make complex texts easier to understand. They often act as visual analogies or metaphors to help learners connect with what they already know to new information to make the learning process smoother. So examples of this are diagrams of equipment. They can be even animations, and like this example, drawings or illustrations to explain complex scientific laws or theories. So these are just some tips when you're using graphics. Make sure that you're using high quality and optimized images. We want to make sure our users can download these images quickly. Some of them are still using mobile devices. Bandwidth is still an issue in many parts of the world, so definitely consider optimizing that. Alt text is important. Again, proximity and alignment. Even alignments within the images can add more visual complexity. So, choose images that are meaningful and simple and can explain the concepts as concisely as possible. And then again, consistency in style and color themes. Before we look into some examples of how to put these some of the techniques and tips into practice, there's a few questions that you can consider about layout, formatting, visual cues, and graphics. And I like to ask, is it needed? Does it communicate concisely? Is it distracting? Does it add to cognitive load unnecessarily? Does it improve the student's learning experience? And is it accessible? So it's also important to consider the overall design cohesiveness. We want to make sure that we're focusing on consistency and predictability. So use formatting and visual cues consistently to mean the same thing across all course pages. Use the same or similar style for graphics and other elements such as tables or icons. So if you apply a treatment to one table, you put borders on it, for example, do that with all of them. Reduce visual complexity as much as possible. Again, left alignment is one of the easiest things you can do, limiting the number and the styles of fonts, limiting the colors. So now we're going to go into the examples. And I noticed we did have a comment from one of our participants.
Yeah, from Jenny
Yeah,
about chunking. Maybe we can answer that question at the end, but I think it's a really good one.
okay, perfect.
So for our example, we're going to use a course homepage as like a case study. Pulling on what we've been talking about, course homepages are sort of your first impression. It's your opportunity to make a good impression, inspire sort of trust, credibility in your course content, excite and engage your students visually. It's also the prime space for wayfinding within your course and a good chance to leverage aesthetics as well to sort of give the vibe that you're looking for your online space. So our first example is what we're going to say out the gate is a bad one. What I'd love is for folks in the audience to post in the chat some of the things that you think are problematic about this course homepage. Anything that jumps out at you, I'll start going through some of the pieces, but I would love to hear. Annoying highlighting color. Oh yeah, when I was making this, I was like, how can I make this as irritating as possible for everyone? Print is too small, purple highlight, font is too small, color is distracting, links are not descriptive. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to go through this sort of piece by piece. So if we're starting at the top, yes, the yellow and purple banner is terrible. One thing I'll note is that the color of the actual text at the top is absolutely not meeting web accessibility standards for contrast. So that's something to take into consideration. We also have a variety of different alignments. So when we were talking earlier about eye tracking, we're really trying to use the real estate of that like left alignment and the top of the page effectively. So because we have alignment in the center, on the left and on the right, it's really, really, unfortunate to kind of look at and pass. The image, I can see Michelle said the image is unrelated and decorative. Again, when we were talking about decorative graphics, they're not the worst thing in the world. It's nice to have some visual elements, but of course it's unrelated. It might be a bit effective because it's funny. Students might appreciate that, but this is actually a GIF as well. So it is animated, something that we're trying to avoid, right? And then the other piece is to, yeah, our list is not descriptive, no descriptive links, no bullet points, all of that. So an alternative, and not the only possible alternative, but something that we've looked at as something that's quite easy to do to build on Canvas, is that we have a graphic at the top. It might inspire maybe something related to the content. For me, looking at this course, I'd imagine it's probably about tech. I've got properly nested headings. I've used colors which are harmonious and match with the graphic at the top. And a lot of attention's been paid to wayfinding. So we've got the course syllabus, learning modules, joining the Zoom meeting. They're immediately visible and accessible for students. I've also used quite a lot of white space just to make sure that things are easy to distinguish from each other. So with that example, and to sort of finish up and give some time for questions, there's been a lot of information today. We recognize that. What we would really love to encourage is to start with one or two of the strategies that we discussed today, because even small changes are going to make a big difference.
And the other thing is there's tons of resources and tools that are available online. So use those to help improve the quality of your online course, and test it with people you know and ask your students. And even if you start with one or two of the strategies, it will make a difference for your students. And the focus that you do on the visual design shows students that you care about the content, and by extension that you care about the students.
So now we'll pass over to everyone here. Thank you everyone for your time. We had one question in the chat, which was about chunking. So it was from Jenny. Chunking makes more pages in a module. I'm wondering if chunking also applies to module length, number of pages in a learning unit. Is there a number of pages that is best? Parm, what do you think?
I've got an answer for that, and I'm going to base it on like the LMS that I'm in. When you have more pages, your table of contents page tends to be longer, but the way readers are looking at that, they're not reading it for comprehension. They tend to read that for scanning to find information. So if you have more pages, I think it's better to do that and have shorter pages that require less scrolling, because you actually want them to be reading for comprehension when they're looking at the content materials. There's also strategies that you can use to help chunk within a content page. I'm a big fan of H5P. You can use that to have interactive content, and then learners can kind of use, like, they're like embedded slides, and they can just kind of go through content that way. Gabrielle,
Yeah.
do you have anything to add?
Totally. I'll mirror what you were saying, I guess, in terms of there are different strategies that you can use. I mean, being cautious as well about using things like tabs or accordions. Again, H5P has an accordion, which is really helpful, but it can be a way to, especially if it's information about like related but not exactly the same topic, there's a lot of text, that can be a way to reduce the number of actual pages that you have in your module, while still chunking the information in a way that is more consumable for students. Were there any other questions, again, in the chat, or folks are welcome to
I think I haven't got the link to the slideshow, but maybe we can just drop that in the chat. Somebody was asking if we can
Yeah,
share
for
that.
sure.
Okay, thanks, Gabrielle. Any more questions? We have like 30 seconds left.
Do you have a good website you like to use, or a good some kind of software to make your own images?
That's a good question. I mean, I personally use a mix of Canva and like Photoshop or Illustrator. I think that's really helpful to sort of, especially like looking online and trying to find Creative Commons versions of like complex ideas can be sort of excruciating. So I think being able to make your own, especially when you have a particular vision, Canva's really user-friendly. There's a premium version, but the free version is really good. So I'd recommend Canva as an option if you don't have access to something more complicated or expensive like Adobe products.
Have you tried using AI to make imagery?
Yeah, I've tested it, I was doing a presentation which had the parable of the elephant and the six blind men, and I came up with incredibly racist images and elephants that didn't have the right number of legs. And what I ended up doing was I found a stock photo image that was adequate. So I think when AI, um, if you want to depict something, you can go down that direction, but I'm very conscientious about using AI. It increased then the environmental impacts and all sort of things like that. So yeah, it's just a balance. That's just my experience with AI.
Okay, so thank you to the presenters. This was an amazing presentation where we learned a lot. I want to remind everyone that all of the recordings for today are on the YouTube channel, and I put a link in the chat. And also, if you want social media contact, it's on the conference website contact page. And I think that's it. I'm going to stop recording unless anyone has anything left to say. Okay. Stopping recording.